We begin with the latest, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where 4 people have been killed when Ukrainian rocket artillery struck a ferry crossing in Kherson city. Authorities in the region, which Russia proclaimed as annexed last month, said this week they plan to evacuate up to 60,000 people over the next 6 days. In a video posted to Telegram, Kirill Stremusov accused the Ukrainian forces of deliberately using fragmentation ammunition to kill as many civilians as possible. He alleges that strikes on civilians and other targets in Kherson region were carried out by the Nazis, presenting the Americans, Europeans and NATO. The Ukrainian military reported fierce fighting in the Berslav district as their forces pressed their advance towards Kherson city, the only regional capital Russian forces have captured. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on the West to warn Russia not to blow up a huge dam that would flood a swath of southern Ukraine as his forces prepare to push Moscow's troops from Kherson in one of the war's most important battles. Mr. Zelensky said in a television address last night that Russian forces had planted explosives inside the huge Nova Kakhovka Dam, which holds back an enormous reservoir that dominates much of southern Ukraine, and were planning to blow it up to cover their retreat. Russia accused Kyiv earlier this week of planning to rocket the dam. Sergei Surovikin, the commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, said Ukrainian forces had already used US-supplied HIMARS missiles against it in what Ukrainian officials called a sign Moscow could be planning to blow it up and blame Kyiv, while neither side produced evidence to back up their allegations. And staying with the Ukrainian president, Russia is attacking Ukrainian power plants because it wants to force people to leave their homes and move westward to European Union nations. Zelensky earlier said this week that Russia had already destroyed around a third of the country's power plants, causing electricity and water cuts as winter approaches. Kyiv ordered nationwide power restrictions for the first time yesterday, Thursday. The United Nations says 7.7 million Ukrainians, roughly 19% of the pre-war population, are now living across Europe after fleeing in the wake of the February 24 invasion. Some refugees have struggled to find decently paid jobs.
Russia is provoking a new wave of migration of Ukrainians to the EU countries. Russia's terror against our energy facilities is aimed at creating as many problems with electricity and heat in Ukraine as possible this autumn and winter, so that many Ukrainians as possible go to your countries. We have information that Russian terrorists mined the dam and unit of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. This is one of the largest energy facilities. The dam of this hydroelectric power plant hold a volume of about 18 million cubic meter of water. If Russian terrorists blow up this dam, more than 80 settlements, including Kherson, will be in the zone of rapid flooding. Hundreds of thousands of people could be affected.
Well, European Union leaders are discussing reducing their economic dependency on China aiding Kyiv and punishing Iran for its involvement in the war that Russia is waging on Ukraine as they meet for a second day of talks in Brussels. The previous day, the 27 EU leaders locked horns over a joint response to the acute energy crunch that has engulfed the bloc since Russia invaded Ukraine. Their summit talks started Thursday afternoon, ran into the wee hours Friday as Germany stuck to its refusal to cap the gas prices, and the 27 could only agree to disagree, declaring they will keep on examining options to put a ceiling on costs. As they return to foreign policy from today, they will have a strategic discussion on their ties with China after the bloc's executive said earlier this week the EU should see Beijing more as a competitor.
We must remain united in Europe to support Ukraine, not only to condemn Russia, but to start working towards a tribunal to figure out how to properly hold Russia also legally accountable for the atrocities that they are committing in Ukraine today. And of course, on top of that and parallel to that, continue to supply Ukraine with all the weapons it needs, especially with the defensive weapons, with the air defense systems that they need very much right now, to continue to supply them with ammunition, to continue to supply them with finances so they can keep their government moving as well.
I'm waiting for the strategic discussion on China. I think it's a very important one. We should discuss more about European dependencies, especially when it comes to new technologies, knowledge, know-how. When we are talking about the strategic autonomy, technology is a key issue here. And we shouldn't be dependent on authoritarian regimes on critical issues such as technologies. We are now seeing how problematic it is that we are so dependent on Russian energy and Russia is using energy as a weapon against Europe.
I think with China is the same as with Russia. It is in their interest that we are divided. It's in our interest that we are united and talk with one voice. And this is extremely important for small countries who don't have that power to have separate relationships. So treating China as a systemic rival and also seeing the developments that are going on there, I think it's very, very important. But it's also very important that we don't have any separate deals made with China, because that would mean that we are weaker as a union.
Meanwhile, another debate on the bloc's response to the energy crunch by EU leaders ended without an agreement on whether to cap gas prices and deciding to keep examining options to put a ceiling on costs. The EU is grappling with high energy prices, driving inflation, raising the prospect of a recession across the continent, a situation aggravated by Russia slashing gas flows following its invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President.
If you look at the steps we've made forward, now this roadmap that now has to be worked on and then implemented, it is a joint purchase, big step forward. It is the rules for sharing gas, so the solidarity agreements and the rules that have to be followed in case of a severe disruption. It is the topic of excessive prices and how to limit them. We will develop a complementary new index to reflect better the LNG price situation. And for the meantime, we are going to establish a market correction mechanism exactly to limit episodes of excessive gas prices and to make sure that there is a clear order in the build of the market.
Russian President Vladimir Putin inspected a training ground for mobilized troops and was shown firing shots from a sniper rifle in footage apparently intended to show his personal backing for soldiers heading to fight in Ukraine. Mr. Putin was accompanied on the trip to Ryazan, southeast of Moscow, by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who reported to him on how the men were being trained. Footage showed a figure who appeared to be Putin lying flat on the ground and firing from a rifle. The visit came a day after Mr. Putin raised Russia's war footing and declared martial law in 4 occupied regions of Ukraine that he moved to annex last month, in a step condemned as illegal by Ukraine, its allies, and the United Nations General Assembly. There he is, the footage, which appears to show him lying flat and firing from a rifle. In the meantime, U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price says the United States has determined that Iranian military personnel were on the ground in Crimea helping the Russian military operate drones provided by Tehran to conduct strikes across Ukraine. According to him, the U.S. is now concerned that Russia may seek to acquire advanced conventional weapons from Iran, such as surface-to-surface missiles for use against Ukraine.
We assess that Iranian military personnel were on the ground in Crimea and assisted Russia in these operations. Russia has received dozens of these UAVs so far and will likely continue to receive additional shipments in the future. It's no secret that a deal does not appear imminent. A deal does not appear in the offing, at least not at the moment, because Iran's demands have consistently gone beyond the four corners of the JCPOA, which is our concerns that Iran would provide this type of support to Russia. Today, we're making very clear as well that in light of Russia's ongoing shortages, some of which are owed to the export controls and the other measures we put in place, we're concerned that Russia may also seek to acquire advanced conventional weapons from Iran. That includes potentially surface-to-air missiles that will almost certainly be used to support Russia's war against Ukraine.
Attorney General Merrick Garland says the United States will be relentless in its efforts to prosecute war crimes in Ukraine. Speaking after meeting with his German counterpart, Marco Buchmann, Garland also said the U.S. prosecutors had charged 5 Russian nationals for sanctions evasion and other violations related to shipping military technologies bought from U.S. manufacturers to Russian buyers, some of which ended up on the battlefield in Ukraine.
To promote just such collaboration, the German federal government is hosting a meeting of the G7 Ministers of Justice in November. We will be bringing together the world's most advanced economies and liberal democracies to explore how better to coordinate the prosecution of war crimes.
Yesterday, the Justice Department unsealed an indictment in the Eastern District of New York against 5 Russian nationals and 2 oil traders charged with a global sanctions, evasion, and money laundering scheme that operated between January 2018 and September of this year. On Monday of this week, our partners in Germany arrested one of the defendants, Yuri Orkov. We are grateful for our partners' work. The indictment alleges that he and a co-conspirator sourced and purchased sensitive military and dual-use technologies from U.S. manufacturers and shipped them to Russia end users, including sanctioned companies that serviced Russia's defense sector. Those technologies included advanced semiconductors and microprocessors that are used in fighter aircraft, missile systems, smart munitions, radar, satellites, and other space-based military applications. Some of the same electronic components obtained through this criminal scheme have been found in Russian weapons platforms on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Well, let's take us back to some of those decisions by the European leaders who were up late in Brussels overnight trying to figure out a way to shield European consumers from the soaring energy prices. We're now being joined by Deutsche Welle correspondent Cassandra Sons. Hi, Cassandra. So it looks like the EU did decide to make a decision. Tell us what decision was reached.
Well, if you were a casual observer, you might think that the agreement or decision was about unity, since that was the big message coming from leaders in the post-negotiation briefings. But after 11 hours of haggling, the big question about whether to impose a gas cap was only partly reached. There's now an agreed-upon, quote, roadmap to set in the future to agree upon a set of measures to lower energy bills. It's a very EU moment. It's a decision to make a decision later.
And Germany is the top economy in the EU, and I understand they were opposed to some of the measures of the energy deal. What are Germany's concerns?
Right. Germany is taking some hits from its fellow EU member nations because of its opposition. Berlin has been the strongest opponent of the price cap because, especially before the invasion of Ukraine, they were a massive buyer of natural gas. And previously, Chancellor Olaf Scholz had said that adding a price cap could encourage sellers to bring their supplies elsewhere. And part of the problem with these negotiations is that the energy mixes of the 27 member nations are so vastly different. It's really difficult for them to see eye to eye on this issue. For example, Spain and Portugal have already functionally set a price cap on gas used to specifically create energy. France criticized Germany when it was really pushing against the gas cap, saying that Germany is isolating itself, though President Macron does now seem satisfied with the result. Some diplomats have said that the bottom line is that Germany is trying to choose supply security while other countries can't keep up with that cost. But on this, Germany does appear to have given ground to allow the EU to edge towards an energy price cap, but many details still have to be worked out.
So if this is a decision to make a decision later, what are the next steps?
This is really a decision to make a decision later. As it stands right now, Germany does look to have bowed to pressure, but it's all very provisional. It's all for now. The decision right now allows for the price cap to possibly go into effect until a new pricing system is devised, but we're all waiting on those details, which could come next week. Energy ministers are meeting, and Chancellor Scholz has already said that an emergency EU leaders meeting could be needed next month. That would effectively give Germany or any other EU nation a veto on the final proposal if needed. EU President Ursula von der Leyen has called what emerged overnight, quote, a very good and solid roadmap.
Thank you, Cassandra. Deutsche Welle correspondent Cassandra Sund for us there from Berlin. Well, let's switch now to other stories, to Britain. And this is where news of Liz Truss's resignation made headlines and has prompted quick reaction from political leaders and media commentators around the world. Among foreign politicians, France's President Emmanuel Macron said that on a personal level, he was always sad to see a colleague go, but that the most important thing was for Britain to find stability. When White House reporters asked US President Joe Biden if Ms. Truss had made the right decision, he replied it was her decision to make, adding that he wouldn't weigh in on her judgment. Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine, said Ms. Truss's exit had been dramatic, but voiced his confidence that British support for Kyiv would not drop. The Ukrainian government was reported in the press to have tweeted and then deleted a post reading "Better call Boris" in an apparent endorsement of any bid by the former Prime Minister to win back Tory leadership. Well, there was little sympathy for Ms. Truss from Russia. Its foreign ministry spokeswoman said the UK had never known such a disgrace of a Prime Minister. In Europe, the Irish Times pulled no punches in describing a low moment in history of British politics. Well, on the next Prime Minister, you might want to tick off British Defence Minister Ben Wallace, who has said he would not stand in the contest to replace Liz Truss as Prime Minister and was leaning towards backing former leader Boris Johnson. After Truss quits Thursday, ending her 6 weeks in power, those who want to replace her are trying to find the 100 votes from Conservative lawmakers needed to run in a contest which the party hopes will reset its ailing fortunes. Mr. Wallace is one of the few ministers to have emerged from recent political turmoil with his credibility enhanced. He is popular with party members and was one of the bookmakers' favourites. Truss's predecessor, Boris Johnson, his former finance minister, Rishi Sunak, are the potential contenders, although neither have formally declared their candidacy yet.
Last time I said I wouldn't stand, it was not something that I was prepared to do. I think you really have to want it as a Prime Minister to do that job. You have to really think it's the job for you. For me, I feel that I can add the best value in keeping people safe at Defence by being the Defence Secretary. It's the job that I have been doing, and it's the job I intend to stay doing. So I am not going to be standing for Prime Minister this time, and the same reasons really apply as last time. Without national security, there is no economic security, and I think that is important. The candidates putting their names forward, they indicate that. But also at the same time, I have to recognise the issue of the mandate. This will be potentially our third Prime Minister since the general election of 2019. That means we have to think about that legitimacy question that the public will be asking themselves, and also about who could win the next election. That's obviously important for any political party at the time. So, at the moment, I would lean towards Boris Johnson. I think he will still have some questions to answer around, obviously, that investigation. Well, I think the Tory party has to settle down and get on with delivering its mandate that it was elected on in 2019 with a massive majority, which is to govern on behalf of the citizens of this country. And I think that means tackling the economic challenges we face tackling the threats globally that we face, and I make sure that's the real #1 priority for us all. Of course, unity is also important. You know, I'll be looking for how the candidates are prepared to bring the party together, because without unity, we can't govern either.
Well, Liz Truss will now be able to claim the £115,000 a year she's entitled to after resigning as Prime Minister. All former Prime Ministers are entitled to the allowance, which they can use for any costs that arise as a result of public duties. But the Labour leader said she has not earned the right to the entitlement, and the Lib Dems say she shouldn't claim the money. The public duty cost allowance was set up by former Tory Prime Minister John Major in March 1991 in the wake of Margaret Thatcher's resignation. It was introduced to assist former Prime Ministers still active in private life, paying for things like office costs or travel to events where they're appearing as ex-Prime Minister. The current limit on what they are able to draw is set at £115,000 and has been frozen since 2011. Well, let's go back to the summit in Brussels, where EU leaders said that they hoped for a political stability in Britain as the country scrambles to replace short-lived Premier Liz Truss. Now, asked about the race to replace Ms. Truss, most leaders arriving at the Brussels summit did not express a preference for any candidate, but said they hoped for calm. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas said she had a good working relationship with Mr. Johnson, who was Prime Minister when Britain finally left the EU after several years of tortuous negotiations, and said that, you know, we're very sad to see the UK struggling with the issues and that they will be missed in the European Union.
It's the fact that stability is really needed in the UK, especially now in this crisis time. We saw already the shock for the economy the last days and weeks because of some directions who were not supported by the financial sector in the UK. So I hope that they will soon have a Prime Minister who's able to get a strong majority also behind him and a stable government for more than 1.5 months.
I have had very good relations with Boris Johnson, but also Liz Truss, so we are very sad to see the UK struggling with the issues, and we miss them in the European Union. So
it's always better to have a Prime Minister that has a future in front of his or her, and we'll follow this in detail. United Kingdom is a neighbor of us. It's a partner in so many domains, and it will remain a partner in so many domains. So we hope to have soon a person who we can discuss so many topics with.
Now let's hear from the leader of the opposition Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, who renewed calls for general elections following Liz Truss's resignation and former Prime Minister Boris Johnson becoming possible contender for the job. While speaking to reporters, he said the country cannot have another experiment at the top of the Tory party.
Look, we've got to get away from this idea that there's a sort of revolving door of chaos and that we just get the next experiment at the top of the Tory party. What matters is what happens to this country. And there's the contrast. More of this chaos or stability under a Labour government. And it's very important, I think, that everybody watching this appreciates we don't have to go on like this. We can have stability. We can have an economy that works for working people. That's why we need a general election. Give people a choice. Do you want to continue with this chaos, which is damaging the economy, or wouldn't you prefer a Labour government and the stability that that will bring for our country? I remind myself that only 3 months ago, Boris Johnson left office because most of those who were serving him on his front bench had declared that he was unfit for office. So to go from the kamikaze budget under Liz Truss back to a man that his own party has declared is unfit for office is the most powerful argument you could possibly have for a general election, so that we can put the alternative case to the country, which is stability, growth, an economy that works for everyone, rather than this chaos.
Well, for citizens, it appears that people in London are split on whether the UK should call for a national election after Prime Minister Liz Truss was forced to resign on Thursday. Let's listen to them.
It's difficult. I don't think there's a way out of this. A general election causes more uncertainty. A lack of general election is thoroughly undemocratic. It's a difficult choice.
I like the sounds of Richie personally, but he's proven that he can do the job in the Parliament, not necessarily as PM, but in other parts of the business. So Boris coming back, I don't know if it's wise going back to that right now.
It's a shambles. The Conservative parties have had 12 years and they've done nothing but catastrophe after catastrophe. So the fact that they think that people will accept a third Prime Minister in 2 months is just not on.
I think that's enough for the time being. We need a bit more stability. General election would add to the turmoil, I think. Obviously, there's a promise that the Labour Party would possibly win or come into power on the back of this, but I would like to see things done more orderly rather than in a time of panic having an election. Maybe wait another year, then have an election if need be. But
he's proven to be a liar and a cheat with a moral vacuum, so the audacity of the man to try and even attempt to do that is uncontemptible.
Dr. Charles Aholo is a lawyer, a law lecturer at Nottingham Law School, Nottingham. Thank you for joining us on the programme.
Thank you, Millicent.
Bit interesting, the comments so far and the political, some would call turmoil we're seeing in Britain. But first, what did you make of Liz Truss's announcement yesterday? Was this something that you expected?
Well, it didn't come to political pundits as a surprise. Most of her colleagues at the House of Commons have been calling for her to quit her position as Prime Minister. I have been following the observations of MPs, and some have described her government as chaotic, and most of them have described her as a money magic economist. And so, as at yesterday when she resigned, a large chunk of the members of the House of Commons are gathering signatures to declare a vote or to pass a vote of no confidence against her. So she did the right thing, and we saw it coming.
So we have now Conservative MPs hoping to succeed Ms. Truss as Prime Minister, racing to find backers, you know, before the Monday deadline. What do you make of what we're hearing, the popular choices?
Well, first, we need to understand what the law says. So the Constitutional Convention in the United Kingdom is that for someone to be nominated a Prime Minister, you must be someone that has the confidence of the House of Commons. So the Cabinet Manual provides in Section 2.7 that the ability of the government to command confidence of the elected House of Commons is central to the authority to govern. And that applies to the Prime Minister. The person who does the nomination is the Crown. But the Crown can only nominate a person who has the confidence of the House of Commons. And that explains the reason why they are all looking for support from the House as a way of bolstering their confidence, their ability to command the confidence of the House. And so at the moment, things are a little bit sketchy, but that's the reason why they are looking for support from the House of Commons.
So do you think that former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has a strong, I mean, legally, he can run again, you know, for Prime Minister, right? Do you think that he could succeed?
Boris Johnson is a very formidable politician. He has proved his mettle. He has demonstrated that before this time he has the confidence of not only the House of Commons, but also the confidence of the British people. And so those who are calling on Boris Johnson to vie again for the position of Prime Ministers, they have the election in mind, and it is purely driven by political interest. They believe that Johnson is the man to beat in any polls at the United Kingdom. The only limitation against his running from a legal perspective is the fact that he is still subject to investigation by the Ethics and Privileges Committee of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. That in itself is a major problem. So the thinking of political purists is that if he comes in as prime minister, that in itself would defeat the investigation. And at the end of the day, the wheels of justice will run very slowly.
So not being a law in your own court in that position. But then looking at the Conservatives, the Conservative MPs, do you think that they are still, you know, a force, they're still popular, you know, in Britain? And this is also considering that opposition Labour is calling for a national election.
Well, this is a very tough time for the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. You heard Sakia Starmer there describing them as a revolving door of chaos. That for me is very heavy. And the fact that they have had 3 prime ministers resign in within short intervals in their government demonstrates the fact that the Conservative Party is still searching for the right kind of leadership, a right kind of leadership that will uphold the values of the British public. And so I think it's a tough time for the Conservative Party. But at the same time, I think that those calling for a general election are also driven by their own personal partisan interest. The Labour Party is calling for a general election because at the moment, the polls do not favor the Conservative Party, and if an election were to be conducted today, they will swim in the parties of the feet. And so they are all driven by their own partisan interest. So, but at the same time, I think that what we need to consider is what the law says. And going by democratic and going by constitutional conventions, to the extent that the Tories still command the majority in the House, all the party needs to do is to throw its weight behind someone who commands the confidence of the House of Commons, and then suggest that person to the Crown to make the appointment as Prime Minister. Because at the end of the day, it is the person who commands the confidence of the House of Commons that will eventually emerge as Prime Minister. I don't think there is any need, legally speaking, from a constitutional perspective, for a general election.
Another question to you on the subject of the opposition, Keir Starmer, who has called on Ms. Truss to give up the yearly allowance, £115,000, that she'll be entitled to as former Prime Minister. Do you think it's a matter of ethics or it's a matter of law?
Well, I think it is a matter of law. It is not a matter of ethics, because the salaries of members of parliament is fixed by the Parliamentary Standards Act of 2009. Even the salaries of ministers is fixed by the Ministerial Salaries Act of 1975. So it is a question of law. And under these laws, there is always room to alter the salaries of these public officers. And so insofar as they are fixed by law, I think only an amendment of law would entitle a person to those salaries or not. I don't think it is a question of ethics. But then we need to also realize that under the ministerial code, prime ministers exist, they are bound by the ministerial code, and they have a duty of accountability. And so if you have not performed the functions of your office, there is absolutely no need why you would claim the monies with respect to that office. Many have described the reign of Liz Truss as calamitous, as abominable, as economic suicide. She presented a plan without subjecting it to a regulatory impact analysis or an economic analysis. And that led to speculations in the British economy that crashed and brought down the pound to an all-time low. So for many, she has not performed the functions of her office, and therefore, from a moral perspective, she's not entitled to the salaries attendant to that and allowances attendant to that office. So you can make an argument for both sides, but I think it is more a matter of law than morality.
We'd like to thank you. Dr. Charles Aholu is a law lecturer at Nottingham Law School. Thank you so much for joining us and your thoughts on this issue.
Thank you, Minister, for having me. Have a great day.
To you as well. Well, let's move away from the politics in Britain now to the United States as it continues to be in a pivotal political moment. Our Washington correspondent Maria Bird discusses the U.S. employment challenges with Democrat and Republican leaders.
U.S. midterm elections are key and critical to the future of major American policies. Gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams provides insight into some of the Democratic Party's position on underemployment.
The economy, inflation, and abortion are going to drive many of the polls this election season, but the job market is still reporting growth. How do you explain the middle class being squeezed, but yet and still they're showing job growth, and we know the economy and inflation are at record highs?
In Georgia, we know that part of the challenge is that for the last 20 years, governors have lured companies to Georgia by promising low wages. And so, yes, Georgia has a fairly full employment story, but many of those jobs pay low wages or stagnant wages. We also know that for African-American men, the growth gap is not only large, but the employment gap remains stubbornly high. And so we have to recognize that the narrative thread of employment, of low unemployment, ignores how much money you make on those jobs and how many of those jobs you have. And in Georgia, we know that those are both dynamic challenges.
While some members of the Democratic Party have identified action plans to address the economic and employment challenges in the U.S., Republican candidates believe the challenges are due to a lack of leadership.
As you talked about some of the main issues, and you talked about unemployment, I know the jobs reports have come out and they're showing to be a little bit better, but we still find the African-American community is suffering as it relates to jobs. And we also find the jobs that are available are not always the jobs that allow individuals to make it to the middle class or to be able to sustain, as you've mentioned, inflation is a huge issue in our country, sustain a lifestyle that is conducive to supporting a family. What are some of your thoughts around how the Republicans can address some of the disproportionate nature in unemployment in America?
It starts with leadership. Sustainable jobs. Sustainable jobs come from low taxes. It comes from making our job market more appealable to our businesses. Yeah, they have the McDonald's and the fast food chains that pays minimum wage.
You keep going back to guns, Stacey, and I think it's going to be your undoing here in Georgia.
We're not seeing that. And so
Georgia,
I think
we're going to have less and less gun laws, whether it's under Republicans or Libertarians. Libertarians don't believe in any gun laws. They believe that you know how to best protect you and your property. And the biggest mass murder in history is government. It's not private citizens. Most private citizens, like I said before, go throughout their day without doing any harm to anybody. However, people in the government with all the guns still go after people with a badge when they shouldn't have to.
The U.S. is less than 3 weeks away from Election Day, and early voting has already surpassed daily numbers in some states. From Washington, Maria Bird, Channels Television News.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he is concerned about any potential delays to the free trade deal with Britain arising from the political instability happening there. Now, he said that he was concerned about that, the potential delays to free trade deal with Britain arising from that particular political turmoil.
Concerned about any delay that would occur to the Australia-UK free trade agreement. I had discussed with Prime Minister Truss the fast tracking of that. We discussed trying to get it concluded before the end of this year to make sure that the appropriate parliamentary processes went through our respective parliaments. And I will, of course, speak to whoever it is that will become the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom about doing that. I must say I've been in office for 5 months. I've met with 2 British Prime Ministers so far, and I obviously will have contact with a third at some time when those issues are concluded.
And Iran's deputy representative to the United Nations rejected the role of Western countries as caretakers of Iranian women. She was speaking during an address to the Security Council yesterday.
In order to advance their rights. The tragic death of Mahsa Amini, a young Iranian girl, has broken the hearts of not only our government, but also the people of my country. We regret the incident and hope to never have to witness such a heartbreaking loss again. A thorough investigation was carried out to determine the circumstances that led to these tragic deaths. So far, the findings of 2 preliminary investigations have been shared with member states and UN-affiliated organizations. Iranian women are smart, well-educated, dedicated, and patriotic and are aware of their rights. They also understand how to engage with the government in a peaceful and constructive manner in order to advance their rights. Therefore, we advise those Western states that they are not required to act as guardians or caretakers of Iranian women or speak on their behalf.
Women and girls are under threat from conflict and repressive regimes, under threat from climate, and under threat from poverty. The eyes of the entire world are on Iran right now. Courageous and brave Iranians from across society, women and men, are protesting the death of Mahsa Amini. They are protesting the fact that she was killed by the Iranian morality police for the crime of being a woman.
Meanwhile, scenes of dozens of supporters of an Iranian opposition group gathering outside the EU institutions to call on EU leaders to listen to the demands of the people who have taken to the streets in protest in the country. The demonstration was organized by the National Council of Resistance of Iran to coincide with a discussion on foreign policy on the agenda of the 2-day EU summit. Although no specific discussion on Iran was foreseen, the Brussels protest comes amid mass protests in Iran itself, ignited by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who had been detained 3 days earlier by Iran's morality police for what they deemed inappropriate dress. The demonstrations have grown into one of the boldest challenges to the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution, though the unrest does not appear close to toppling the system. And 2 major Belgian trade unions organized demonstrations at the EU headquarters the first day at the EU Autumn Summit. And this time, they're protesting against rising prices and related government policies. Following the imposition of series of sanctions against Russia, energy prices, commodity prices have risen sharply in Europe, severely damaging the economy and people's livelihood. Hundreds of people gathered from the Belgian capital near the EU headquarters. Many held slogans hoping that EU leaders attending the summit would pay more attention to people's demands and come up with practical measures to improve people's livelihoods. Some weather updates now. Wildfires in Oregon and Washington are blanketing much of America's Pacific Northwest with smoke, choking residents in Seattle, Portland, and other parts of the 2 states with the worst air in the United States. The Seattle area, home to some 4 million people, the sky was brown and the air difficult to breathe. When the sun peeked through, it was orange and as well considered to be very unhealthy. In Oregon, smoke from the numerous fires has been held close to the ground by a weather system.
Thank you.
It's making me dizzy. Like, I usually walk around a lot. I've been having to cut down my exercising, and I had to take the bus, for instance, and in the morning I don't really take the bus. That's more of an afternoon thing, but yeah, I had to catch the bus this morning, and I'm not happy about that.
In one sense, it's not necessarily something that is entirely out of the norm for living in a fire-prone region like this, right? And certainly in the past, when there would have been periods of high fire activity, there would have been smoke regionally around the area. Another way to think about it is there's lots of reason to expect that as the climate continues to warm, we are going to see a lengthening of the fire season, and that's been shown in many regions around the globe. And so as that happens, we're basically extending the period of time when fires could be burning, and we can think of this as, in some ways, something that we should be expecting more of in the future in terms of these smoky days. And so that's where it really becomes important to think about being ready for that and having capacity to adapt to that and protect health and exposure to a lot of that smoke.
You know, I was hoping to see a beautiful day here in Seattle, but unfortunately you have all this smoke coming in. But I will be back, so hopefully I'll see much more of the bay and everything. I'm enjoying my day with my friends right now. I'm not sure what the causes are, but I think sometimes we have some, fires and so forth, and it's part of human life, something you have to sustain the reality of being the smoke and hopefully pray for good weather.
Meanwhile, authorities say a huge blaze erupted in central Mexico when a fuel tanker truck crashed into an overpass by a rail line, scorching homes, engulfing the area in thick smoke and leading to mass evacuation. But there were no fatalities. Eyewitness drone footage shows a large smoke cloud rising from the site of the collision in the city of Aguascalientes. The fire chief there, Miguel Murillo, said between 800 and 1,000 people were evacuated after the tanker collided with the overpass and set fire to a nearby residential area. 12 people had been rescued from houses and no one was injured, Murillo said, although one person had suffered minor effects from smoke inhalation. Well, back to politics in Italy, where Giorgia Meloni told President Sergio Mattarella that she was ready to become prime minister and could swiftly form a new government despite tumult within her right-wing coalition. Meloni, head of the Nationalist Brothers of Italy party, met the president alongside her main allies, Matteo Salvini, who leads the far-right League, and Silvio Berlusconi, founder of the conservative Forza Italia party. Mattarella is expected to call her back to his office later in the day to formally ask her to become prime minister, and the new cabinet is likely to be sworn in over the weekend. The Conservative bloc won a commanding parliamentary majority at the September 25 general election, with Meloni's party taking the most votes, putting her in pole position to become Italy's first female prime minister. And finally, on the program, let's take you now on a journey, and this is to meet Australia-based artist Marina Debris, who is collecting debris from beach and transforming it into art. Take a look.
Nearly every morning, an Australia-based environmental artist heads down to her local beach in Sydney to collect waste that has washed ashore overnight. Marina Debris has been doing this for over 20 years, yet every morning there is more that needs collecting.
I feel guilty if I go a day without coming down here, and I'm pretty much the only one who collects on this beach that I know of, so I feel like I'm kind of the steward of this particular beach, and it's pretty bad. Like it can get really bad.
In 2009, frustrated by the continued state of pollution when she was living in the U.S. city of Los Angeles, Debris put her creative talents to work and began transforming trash into sculptures to raise awareness about single-use plastics and ocean pollution.
It was just really purely frustration to, do something with the rubbish I was collecting and try to make a statement.
Debris' works are made wholly of reused materials, or as close as she can get to that, which also includes the wires used to connect pieces to the hand drill she uses, which she found dumped on the street. She also does not clean or alter the rubbish before using them in her works, as she does not want to glorify it, preferring to confront her viewers with the rubbish in its raw form. Explaining the name of the artwork, Debris said that while people may not feel like their actions matter in the big picture, if every single person in the world picked up one piece of rubbish, that would be 7.8 billion pieces of rubbish, making a significant impact on ocean pollution.
It's ugly. It's an ugly subject, and I just want people to react in a way where they kind of gasp and take notice of how much waste we're putting out in the ocean.
Local residents who viewed the sculpture said it made them sad to see the amount of waste that had ended up in the ocean, but were glad debris had reused pieces to create awareness.
Kind of sad if that's how much stuff's washing up on our shore. But it's good that someone's out there actually collecting it and doing something out of it. I guess it's recycling in a way. It also is a symbol that we need to be a little bit more careful with how we dispose of plastics and not what.
Debris' latest sculpture, Just a Drop in the Ocean, said 7.8 billion people is currently on display as part of the 3-week sculpture by the Sea Open Air Art Exhibition located near Bondi Beach, which opened on Friday and will run until November the 7th.
And that's the world today for the week. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Bye.